Hello, everyone, and welcome to my session, Discover Records in Microsoft Teams. My name is Rick Wilson. Some of you may recognize me from past ARMA events. As part of Sherpa Software, I co-hosted 2 sessions at last year's ARMA conference, one on user-driven data governance and a workshop session on defensible disposition. I also hosted an in-person session at the 2019 ARMA conference in Nashville. Earlier this year, Gimmal acquired Sherpa Software, and I'm now pleased to be part of the Gimmal Product Management team. If you aren't familiar with Gimmal, our mission's always been to help our clients manage one of their most valuable assets, information. And we do that by providing tools that help you balance the value of your information against the risk that it inherently carries. As you can see on the slide, Gimmal has a suite of tools that can help you discover, manage, and govern both electronic and physical content. In today's session, we'll be looking a little bit deeper at Gimmal Discover, our information governance tool, and how that can work with Microsoft Teams to help you mitigate risk. We'll also touch on the Gimmal Records product. Our focus today, of course, is on Microsoft Teams. And I'll be speaking a bit about some of the risks involved with Teams content, Gimmal tools that you can leverage to help mitigate that risk, and how those tools can help provide visibility into your team's environment moving forward. Well, this topic has become increasingly important over the past year because Microsoft Teams adoption has literally taken off like a rocket. If you think back to that 2019 timeframe when many of us were together at the Gaylord Resort in Nashville, Microsoft and Slack, who was at that time considered the dominant player in the market space, were still pretty closely tied in terms of market share. But then Microsoft did exactly what they did to Netscape back in the late 1990s. They unleashed the full force of their massive development team, acquired technology to fill the gaps in their product line, and they funded it all with a virtually unlimited cash stream. That investment began to pay off, and Teams slowly started to gain market share over Slack. Then the pandemic struck. And you can see by this chart that it just popped up from that 2019 timeframe that we were just talking about, what happened in terms of Microsoft Teams adoption over the last 18 months or so. It's not very often that you run across a product adoption graph that looks like that, but it's backed by some really significant statistics. 95 million users in the year 2020, up to 145 million from 75 year over year, 894% growth. Now, even Zoom with their conferencing application had tremendous growth in 2020. But Microsoft beat even Zoom's number in that context. More than 500,000 organizations today using Teams and a multi-billion-dollar business for the Microsoft product line. If you're not using Teams currently, it could be showing up soon in your environment. And if Teams is already embedded in your organizational DNA, there are some risk areas that you should be aware of. When we, as end users, load the Teams client, our channels, chats, messages, etc., are all displayed in a well-organized central view. Behind the scenes, though, it's a little bit more complicated. First, some of the Teams content, notably chats, are actually being stored inside a hidden folder within your mailbox. Next, documents attached to a Teams discussion are being stored in SharePoint. And finally, documents that you give others access to are being stored in OneDrive for business. If you think about those caveats, it changes the picture a bit. You may already have policies about how content is managed in SharePoint. But what if you didn't realize Teams content is being stored there as well? And the same is true of OneDrive. Some of our enterprise clients, in fact, haven't even rolled OneDrive support out to their user community yet. But because they are using Teams, information is being stored there, often without any oversight. And this could pose a huge risk in terms of client confidentiality or sensitive data exposure. With this in mind, Gimmal typically recommends that our clients using Teams conduct an internal review. This is sort of a prerequisite step that you would take before trying to govern content in Teams. And that review process involves an internal audit of not only your record-keeping process, but also your information governance approach. What you want to do is establish answers to questions like, what is deemed a record? What information is considered sensitive? Should certain things be retained? Can I dispose of them immediately? Undoubtedly, you've answered many of these questions for the content areas that you're used to supporting. Network file shares, perhaps user workstations, maybe even SharePoint in some situations. But you may not have considered the answers to those questions in the context of what Microsoft Teams is doing with that information. Do you have some kind of policy around how you want to handle that OneDrive information when it's being stored in the cloud? Have you put in place a process to scan it to make sure there's not client information that could potentially be exposed in SharePoint or OneDrive? Given the fact that that information you see within your Teams environments being stored in a variety of locations, answers to those questions are a key consideration that will become pivotal as you decide how to manage your Teams content moving forward. At Gimmal, we're trying to help our clients assess their Teams risk exposure. And we've recently added support for Microsoft Teams to our information governance tool, Gimmal Discover. In the context of Gimmal Discover, we wanted to expose a few different areas of Teams information to our clients. We wanted to provide a facility to help you analyze information, some of the things we just talked about, client confidentiality, sensitive data, giving you different tools to be able to interrogate your information. And that could be something as simple as metadata like age, date, size, or it could be a little bit more sophisticated, things like patterns or regular expressions, keyword terms. We wanted to provide a way that you could create reports to be able to manage that content and ultimately give you the information you need to take action on that Teams-based information that's being stored. We're going to take a look at Gimmal Discover in just a minute and see how you can answer some of those questions with the product. First, I wanted to mention the fact that Gimmal Discover is developed or provided to our clients in a hosted environment. So part of Gimmal Discover is a hosted dashboard where you manage and monitor the application. And that's backed up by components that you install locally to connect to your various content areas. So let's take a look at what that looks like from a product point of view. I've switched over to a screen where I've logged into a Gimmal Discover session as a full administrator. And you can see all of the facets of the tool displayed on this user interface. Across the top, we've got access to 3 different components or modules, as we call them in Gimmal Discover. There's a data governance area. Data governance allows you to define and apply policy controls to your information. There's a classification area where you can establish rules to mark content as being in a specific category: personal, private, confidential, things like that. And there's an e-discovery module where you can give your legal teams access to be able to search for and identify information that could be part of a litigation. We've also seen a dramatic increase in the e-discovery toolset being used by privacy responsible folks inside an organization, and perhaps by your outside legal team. Each of these modules is served, as I mentioned earlier, by some software that you deploy internally to connect to your content areas. So if we move to administration and open up our data source view, you can see here the list of various content areas that Gimmal Discover can connect to. We're going to focus, of course, on Teams today as part of our discussion, but there's a wide variety of content that you could apply the same methodology to. And in fact, many of our clients today are using it for their mailbox environment in Office 365 or even on-premise Exchange, as well as network file shares. And this is kind of an interesting sidebar. Our largest customer of Gimmal Discover today is using the tool to monitor workstations for their employees, somewhere in excess of 100,000 devices that they scan using Gimmal Discover to be able to identify client confidential information that might be being stored on employee devices. A really handy use case with a very large work-at-home population in the environment today. So these pieces of software that you see represented on the list connect to your content area. They, in turn, scan that content area and identify what we refer to as data targets. So you can see as I click into this list in my Microsoft Teams environment here at Gimmal, I've got 75 Teams sites that were being identified by the client agent. And those Teams sites, once they've been established and identified and added to the Discover database, can be referenced in the data governance or Discover areas that we talked about earlier. We're going to take a look at how that actually bubbles up. So let me move briefly into e-discovery. We'll start there and then we'll segue into data governance. So from an e-discovery point of view, of course, as I mentioned, this was designed and intended for a legal audience inside your environment, in-house counsel, paralegals. Some of our clients give outside counsel access to it. But we also are starting to see it used by the privacy departments or maybe other areas inside the organization that need a simple, very non-technical way to be able to search for content. That begins by creating a matter where they define the search criteria, maybe the name of the case if it's a litigation, who should have access to it, and so forth. From that matter area, they can create holds if they need to for custodian notification. But the main event, of course, in this process is being able to search content. And I'm going to open this search just quickly so you can see what a search looks like. As I mentioned earlier, it's designed for non-technical users. So as you perform a search inside the e-discovery area against your team's content, you do that by answering questions. What do you want to name your search? What's it related to? Which case? Well, how do you want to handle your search results? And you can see here I'm bringing back some full text view of my results. I'll show you that in just a moment. Where are we going to be performing the search? You can see I've selected Teams as my target area for content in this particular search, but you could select more than one, obviously. Which Teams areas are we going to be performing the search against? And I've selected from my list a number of teams where I want my search criteria to be applied. Are there, in fact, specific criteria about the content that I'm interested in? So this is that metadata, if you will, the age, date, size type information we talked about earlier. And then finally, this is probably the most powerful part of the search environment. What are the criteria that we're going to use to perform the search? And you can see there's a number of options on the screen here. We can do just simple booleans with an any or all, or we can get more sophisticated with a search expression to help you identify how that content search is going to be performed. Down here in the search terms area, you can see some of that expression criteria showing up. So in the first block here, we have a proximity. So we're looking for two terms, the term PI, which we use for our program interval planning, whenever it occurs within 10 words of the word schedule. So we're doing that proximity check between those two words. We're also adding some other designated terms to that search. So do we find the word planning, ELT, SAP? We've got an and condition here where we're looking for that string also. So do we have Azure and DevOps together? So these are our search criteria. That creates the search. We save it then, which puts it into the list to be executed. And you can come in and run that search on a designated basis, or you can attach it to a schedule if you'd like it to occur on a recurring basis. Maybe you want to perform that search once a week and look for example, sensitive data that might be being stored in your Microsoft Teams information. When those searches complete, you're presented with a review panel where you can go in and look at the search results and be able to identify what information was actually being returned on the basis of that search. So we can see here, I found a few exceptions. That's what the red triangles indicate. Oftentimes, those are files that are either password protected, or perhaps they are too large. There's some size criteria that you can apply to prevent the search from stopping on a very large file. So I'm going to open up my filter area and remove those by selecting a view of my results only. And now you can see those red triangle results are gone. So in this display, I can see the fact that this result occurred in my R&D team. And I can see that it was in a particular channel inside that team. And I can see where the keyword term actually occurred over here. If there was some kind of information attached to this particular result, I can bring up that information by clicking on this pink icon and get a little bit deeper view of perhaps the document, the spreadsheet, or the text relevant to that particular chat. So this provides a great way to kind of get a feel for what results are being stored out there in your environment. Of course, there's a number of ways to sort and filter these results so you can control how they're being performed and returned to you. In a parallel use case, we can do a similar kind of thing in data governance. The difference in our data governance module is it provides you a lot more granularity with regards to how you want to interrogate your content. And we do that by identifying a workflow. So workflows are a process that you can create to set rules on how you're going to evaluate content. What are the criteria that we want to use to examine a particular piece of information? Maybe a specific channel or a specific file name or file type. What do we want to do with that piece of content once it meets that criteria? Those workflows map out that kind of information for you. And they're attached to a policy so that you can kind of see how that information runs from a performance point of view. So I'm going to filter down and look for one of my team's policies in the list here. And I can see I found a Microsoft Teams search. And I can see in this workflow, it was this Teams content search was the workflow that was used to control that search. And that workflow looks like a flow chart. And from the flow chart, I progress down through a hierarchy, look at the team, look at the channel, look at the individual items inside. In this case, I'm selecting objects inside the team. And I'm doing a test of the work of the contents. And you can see over here in this truncated view of the keyword expression, I'm using the same keyword syntax that I showed you in eDiscovery. So that's how the information search is being performed. I coded that workflow to produce a report for me. Very similar to what we looked at in the eDiscovery area. And I can see here is my Microsoft Teams keyword search results. 347 items bubbled up. And again, I get a view of that content. So I know what team that individual result occurred in, what channel within the team. In some cases, the result was a document. So I can see here in that particular chat, this document met my keyword term. And I can see a little bit about the keyword result over here in my found column. And just like in eDiscovery, if I want to get more context around that item, I can bring up more information about it and kind of scroll down to see what was contained inside the document. So this gives me an alternate way maybe with a little bit more specificity to be able to search my content inside Microsoft Teams and identify sensitive information that needs to be managed. Currently, we're providing reporting-only views into Microsoft Teams content, and we're in the process of evaluating what actions might make sense to be able to perform on that content. The copy, move, delete kinds of things that we provide today around email or files or workstation hard drive content. Although we don't have classification in Teams yet, just mention quickly that Gimmal Discover from just an information governance point of view also provides that classification where you could define perhaps record categories and organize content on a network file share or a workstation or messages in your environment into particular categories that you decide are important. So that's a quick view of what Gimmal Discover looks like, especially in a Teams context and the way you can manage or search some of your information inside Teams to help identify those sensitive items and those risk items. We've also got exposure in Gimmal Records to be able to help you track that information moving forward. So if your information governance team is using Gimmal Discover, your records management team may want to be able to use Gimmal Records to apply classification rules, and more importantly, track those items for ultimate disposition. So just be aware of the fact that there are some other tools available in the Gimmal environment that may help you round out your whole records approach as you start to consider how to use Teams in that context. So that wraps up my content for today. I hope you found that helpful in some fashion, and I'd be happy to address any questions that you might have with the remainder of the time in the session here.